right, good morning, everybody. We can get rolling here. Just as a reminder, I am recording this. I will apologize in advance if we jump around today a bit. We'll definitely cover 8 and 9, and we'll finish up with non-energy benefits. Joe Loper indicated he had some more information on the discount rate, so we'll touch on that. And I know Chris Nemi apparently has wants to hit on marginal abatement cost option, or has a presentation about that. And due to time constraints, we're going to kick off with that. Chris, are you there, sir? Chris? I saw him up there earlier. Morning, Joe. You know where? Oh, there you are, Chris. Chris, did you want to kick off things with the marginal abatement cost option? I know Joe had indicated you had some time constraints. You're muted, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I hear a little echo. Hopefully that's just me. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I just have a few slides that I'm going to share. And the topic that I'm addressing is the choice between two different methods for evaluating reductions in carbon emissions: the social or damage cost method and the marginal abatements cost method. We talked about this a little bit before, but it's probably useful to do a quick summary of what the difference is between these two methods. First, the social cost of carbon, or sometimes known as the damage cost, is an estimate of the economic value of the damage caused by greenhouse gas emissions. Because it's a global estimate, it's equally applicable to emissions from any sector: the electricity sector, natural gas use, transportation, etc. It probably goes without saying that it's conceptually challenging to quantify, and there's going to be some significant uncertainty in quantification of those damages, because we're talking about all kinds of damages well out into the future, from increased storms, loss of biodiversity, health impacts, a whole range of things. However, there's been a lot of work done on this topic, and there are references available nationally and in some cases from some other states. One disadvantage of this method is that the conclusions about the value of the damage of greenhouse gas emissions are extremely sensitive to discount rate assumptions. As a result, depending on which discount rate you choose, you can end up with a value per ton of greenhouse gas emissions that is many multiples of what it would take to actually reduce a state's greenhouse gas emissions to net zero. And one can ask the question, does that make sense? Alternatively, if you have a higher discount rate, the result can be that it isn't even cost effective to meet the state's emission reduction goals. And that obviously doesn't make sense if the result of the cost of carbon value is supposed to be used to make choices between different resources for meeting the state's policy goals. So that's the social or damage cost method. The marginal abatement cost method is different. Instead of measuring the damage that greenhouse gas emissions produce and monetizing them, it is instead an estimate of the marginal cost to reduce emissions to levels necessary to stabilize climate. One can debate the details of exactly what those emission reductions are and what the trajectories are, but there's general agreement, I think, about within a certain error band about what those numbers might be. This is conceptually less challenging to quantify, and there's undoubtedly less uncertainty. There's obviously some uncertainty when we're forecasting future costs of wind resources and other resources that would need to be invested in to reduce emissions, but it's easier to get one's hands around with more confidence, I think, than what's the value of reduced frequency of severe storms. However, the marginal abatement cost value needs to be rooted in an analysis of what the various resource investments would need to be in order to achieve that level of emission reduction. And those analyses are not available everywhere. And as I understand it, they may not yet be currently available in Maryland. In contrast to the damage cost method, the marginal abatement cost method is not particularly sensitive to the discount rate that you choose. So that's an advantage. Using the marginal abatement cost method ensures that the decisions regarding which resources merit investment are inherently consistent with what it would take for the state to achieve its proportional contribution to climate stabilization. One important note to make about this is that the result in terms of what is the marginal abatement cost will be different for different sectors. Decarbonizing the electric grid may be cheaper than decarbonizing buildings that are currently using natural gas and fuel oil and propane and other fossil fuels. And it may also be different than the marginal abatement cost for the transportation sector. So you may need to use different marginal abatement costs for each of those sectors. Now, what I've got on this slide is the results of work that was done in New England as part of the 2021 Avoided Energy Supply Cost Study. In New England, this study is undertaken every 3 years to update avoided cost assumptions used for energy efficiency, cost effectiveness assessments, and demand response and electrification measures too. And you can see in the column that's labeled AESC 2021, these are the values that the report came up with different methods of estimating the value of carbon emission reductions. The number at the top, the $128, is the estimate using the social cost of carbon at a 2% discount rate. Now, as noted, that value is highly sensitive to discount rate. And as the note below shows, if instead of 2%, we used a 3% real discount rate, it would be worth only $57. Alternatively, if we used a 1% real discount rate, it would be worth $407 a ton. So quite a range, an order of magnitude difference in the value between a 1% and a 3% real discount rate. And given New England's electricity generation profile and loss rates and other factors, that $128 is worth a little less than 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And you can see at a 3% real discount rate, it would be more like 2 cents. And at a 1% real discount rate, it'd be more like 15 or 16 cents. Now down in the 2 rows at the bottom of the table, you see that there is an estimates of the marginal abatement cost. The $125 value is the marginal abatement cost estimated for the New England electric grid. And the $493 per ton value was an estimate developed for the first time in this study for the marginal abatement cost of decarbonizing buildings that are currently using natural gas. And the proxy for that value was the forecast cost of renewable gas at a significant scale. So you can see that somewhat coincidentally, a 2% discount rate for the social cost of carbon produced a value per ton of greenhouse gas emission reduction that was very similar to the marginal abatement cost for the electric grid. However, the marginal abatement cost for natural gas was much higher.
Chris, you got a question? Yes? Dylan?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you want questions now, Chris, but just a clarifying question. The marginal cost of abatement was based on what carbon goal or framework? Because it needs to be linked to a specific target of emission reductions, correct? And can you say
yes,
a little bit what that was?
Yes, and from my perspective, it doesn't make sense to use the marginal abatement cost method unless you're looking at what the marginal abatement cost would be for a very dramatic reduction over time of greenhouse gas emissions, consistent with levels necessary to stabilize the climate. If you have a 10% emission reduction goal, the marginal abatement cost will be low, but it's not really a good alternative to the social cost of carbon in that context, if the state has concerns about climate change. In New England, I have to go back to look at the study to get the details, but I believe this was looking at something on the order of a 90% reduction in emissions by 2050 with a trajectory that gets us from here to there.
Thank you.
So this is my last slide. Just wanted to give a sense of how some states in the Northeast are dealing with these choices. And there's no one right answer. In Massachusetts, the utilities actually hired Synapse, which was the firm that led the work on the avoided energy supply cost study, to do an update to the work on the cost of carbon, which focused on a 1% real discount rate. And that was done based on a sense that the policies of the state should drive a focus on a lower discount rate in essence. So that I don't know if that's been nailed down yet, but that's appears to be where the Massachusetts utilities are headed. In Vermont, the state had historically been using a cost of carbon of about $100 a ton. And it appears as if they're about to move to using the $128 a ton that's based on the 2% real discount rate. In both Connecticut and Rhode Island, it is my understanding, they are using or planning to use the marginal abatement cost method for the electricity sector, which gets at the $125 a ton. And then lastly, New York, I believe, has adopted the 2% real discount rate based social cost of carbon. And in fact, the New England Avoided Energy Supply Cost Study made use of the work that New York had done to take the federal analyses and translate them into results at lower discount rates. So that's all I wanted to share, just to lay out that there are options here. In my personal view, if one has a analytical basis for using the marginal abatement cost method, that can be preferable to the social cost of carbon. But as noted earlier, there can be some challenges with that as well, including whether we have a referenceable analytical basis for it in Maryland. So with that, I will stop.
All right. Thank you, sir. Joe.
You have a question with in the case of Empower, we're doing 3-year cycles. So really we're talking 24, 27. I mean, 24, 25, 26 is the next one, and then on. If you're doing your marginal abatement cost, the Maryland goal is what, 40% by 2050 or something. I mean, by 50% by 2040 or something, depending on which
2030.
goal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've seen several. And so would you look at the marginal abatement cost that would be contemporaneous with the Empower 3-year cycle, or do you look at that ultimate marginal abatement cost? So to get to the final goal, it's going to be much more expensive than what's going to be happening likely 5 years from now.
Yeah, good question, Joe. I think that you need to recognize first that efficiency measures installed in 22 to 24, in some cases, are going to last into the 2040s and beyond. So you actually need to have the trajectory of emission reductions that's going to be required to get all the way to the 2050 endpoint. And by the way, when I showed the $128 values for the social cost of carbon, for example, that was based on a 15-year levelized value.
Yep.
It's
Okay.
a kind of proxy, I think, for typical life of efficiency measures.
And I have to go think about your response. My silence is not agreement necessarily. So, and this is the first time I'm seeing this presentation too. And so I want to go back and think about some things. I have some significant, I currently do not think the marginal abatement cost gets as much at this point, but I'm looking to be persuaded. So that's
I think the biggest challenge to it, Joe, is
Yeah.
if you don't have a basis for estimating what its value is for Maryland.
Yeah, that's a big hole. The other for me is it's still, to me, and I'm still working through it in my head with your help. Is just that it seems circular to me. You can't set your goal without having some sort of at least implicit discount rate. About how you value the future. If you value the future at a 5% discount rate, then you're going to reduce emissions by a much lower percentage than if you have a 1%. Just you value the future with a 1% discount rate, and then the marginal abatement cost picks up off whatever that goal is, and so somebody had to have a discount rate in there, and so I'm not sure. Yeah, that's what's unclear to me. And so if I was going to make it simple, then I would just go, well, okay, the state assembly said we got to reach this certain goal. MDE has done this stack of different resources that it's going to use to meet that goal. Empower is, continuing at current levels plus whatever the beneficial electrification component is, and you just back out of that, right? So you build your cost effectiveness to meet that expectation of MDE, in which case all this discussion doesn't matter. You just come up with assumptions, that get you there.
Sure.
And, so that's why I'm not quite clear what the marginal abatement gets us, but I think it's an excellent discussion. It's always, a question mark in these things, but
Yeah, I think the principal advantage, Joe, is that it represents the cost of the last unit of emission reduction that's necessary to achieve the kind of emission reductions necessary to stabilize the climate. And given that, you don't need to get into this challenging debate about what discount rate makes sense. And your benefit cost analyses are inherently then tied to the actual amount of emission reduction that's necessary to achieve. If you use the social cost of carbon, you can pick a discount rate that is, as I said earlier, multiples of what it would actually take to get to net zero if you invested in all resources that were cost effective with that cost of carbon at that very low discount rate. And that kind of doesn't make sense because, why would I invest in a efficiency resource that's cost effective at only $300 a ton of carbon when I can do something else that will still get me to net zero emissions by 2050 for $200 a ton? And on the other end of the spectrum, if I picked a 3% real discount rate and conclude that I shouldn't do any energy efficiency that isn't cost effective with a $50 or $60 a ton, value for carbon emission reductions. But if I applied that same logic to all resources, I would never get close to fully decarbonizing the grid. When my policy tells me that's what I need to do, that's irrational too. So in the end, where you pick the discount rate for the social cost of carbon is critically important. And it's hard to establish a kind of empirical basis for what it should be, other than to do what you just said, which is to back into it. We know we need X amount of reductions. We know our models tell us that we need 20% energy savings from efficiency to get us there in the least cost way. And that tells us that our discount rate should be X for the value of carbon. It's a kind of backwards way of estimating what the value should be.
If I were comparing Empower, if I did a cost effectiveness comparing Empower or looking at Empower programs, how to what extent can I use that for with these different methods, or are there advantages or disadvantages with these different methods for comparing the Empower program to other abatement resources? In other words, if I'm doing a cost-effective, if I was doing let's say a McKinsey style, marginal abatement supply curve, and I'm trying to put energy efficiency in there somewhere along with nukes and clean coal and everything else you can think of. I'm just trying to think about how my cost effectiveness in that case, in that McKinsey style curve anyway, would not even include an emissions
Exactly.
benefit.
Exactly. What you should do in that case is you develop a supply curve of carbon emission reductions, and it would be a net cost per ton of carbon. So you take all of the benefits of efficiency resources and you subtract those benefits from the costs, and then you divide it by the tons of carbon saved. And some efficiency measures will reduce carbon for negative $100 a ton because they're cost effective without even considering the value of carbon emission reductions. Some are not and might be cost effective at a threshold of $50 a ton, others at $200 a ton, and so on. And the same would be true for wind and solar and other resources you could consider in your supply curve. And you can build that supply curve and identify the amount of emission reductions you need. And that would then define what the marginal abatement cost would be. The last unit that you need to get to that level of emission reductions when you've stacked them all up in from least costly to most costly.
The reason I ask is, in some ways, you know, we're leaning on the California Standard Practice Manual type, you know, societal cost test, and not really considering, you know, to what or I guess we haven't really talked about in this context, you know, how we would go, you know, rank order different Empower programs, right? For portfolio design within within Empower, but also for those programs relative to all those other resources that are on that abatement, you know, supply curve.
Right.
And, you know, that it might be something we want to think about, you know, given the interest of doing a societal cost test and all that, that we not somehow dismiss that, you know, our ability to do that. It's a very different, it's a different exercise that we haven't really even talked, but that may be the, you know, if you think about it in terms of what we've been told, you know, the Maryland assemblies have told us what to do, right? And we're kind of, you know, people disagree on to what extent they've told us to do it versus, you know, advised us to do it or whatever. You know, if you look at it in the sense that we already know what we got to do, then the question is, how do you do it most cost effectively? And in that case, in some ways, we're having the wrong discussion, right? We're talking about a societal cost test, which is not going to help anybody, not going to inform any of that decision, you know, except to the extent that we can take the societal cost test and then we could compare programs, the cost effectiveness of programs within Empower. But I'm not sure it helps us with, you know, looking at that supply curve.
It's one of the challenges of looking at energy efficiency and EVs and other electrification and supply side investments in renewables, all in separate silos.
Chris, Dylan, before I get to you, there's a question in the chat. Does marginal abatement costs change over time?
Yes, it does. In fact, you'll notice, if I put it back up again, you'd notice that the marginal abatement cost for the electric grid in New England at $125 a ton was about $50 a ton more than it was in the 2018 study. And one of the main reasons for that is that avoided costs of fossil generation, you know, gas plants, had come down relative to 2018. So in both cases, the 2018 study and the 2021 study, the marginal abatement resource on the grid was estimated to be offshore wind resources. And even if the cost of offshore wind resources stays the same, and that can change, and they did change, but for the argument's sake, even if they stayed the same, our best estimates in 2018 and our best estimates in 2021, the marginal cost would be the difference between those offshore wind resources in the fossil fuel resources that they're displacing. So if the cost of the fossil fuel resources go down, the incremental cost of abatement goes up, and vice versa. So one of the interesting things about that, though, is while the marginal abatement costs went up non-trivially, the total effect on avoided costs was smaller, because we had a reduction in New England of the avoided cost of energy, which caused the abatement cost of carbon emission reductions to go up, and those two things at least significantly offset each other. So it creates in a way a more kind of stable set of avoided costs in aggregate.
All right, thank you, sir. And before I forget, would it be possible for you to share your slides with the
Absolutely.
group? Okay. Dylan, you had a question, sir.
A comment, actually, Your Honor, and I'll just introduce myself again, Dylan Voorhees, with VEIC, working with OPC. And Nicole can speak today about kind of OPC's position on this question. I think there's interest in both of these methods and still kind of evaluating them. So a couple just observations. I think there's a series of questions that helps us maybe choose between these tools or the application of them. The first question is sort of threshold. Are the carbon reduction targets for the state clear? And I would argue, yes, they are. There's details, but we have actually a pretty clear and a statutorily clear direction about the carbon targets. The second question is, do we know where those carbon reductions should come from? And I think there the answer is, unfortunately, we don't really. And I think we have a plan that models where some reductions could come from, but I don't think that's a plan that necessarily assigns obligations to Empower and other resources. It starts to, but I think it's quite imperfect. Do we know the costs of those abatements? As Chris, you've said, we don't really, but we're maybe trying, and it's not inconceivable that you could do those. But estimating costs of any abatement out 5 or more years, I mean, that's quite difficult, and it will evolve as technologies and our understanding of the economics evolve. And I guess sort of a key point for me is that, and I think this gets a little bit to some of the questions you were asking also, Joe, is I see this cost effectiveness test as both a tool to achieve the policy, those carbon reductions, and a feedback mechanism or a feedback measure about the relative value of carbon abatement from Empower versus other resources. And I would also say within Empower, to your point, Joe. I mean, I think even at a micro level, it helps us. But from a broader policy level, it is not only a tool that says, hey, we know what we need. We know what we need to do. We know what it's going to cost. We know what Empower has to do and everything else has to do. And we're just going to use this cost effectiveness tool as a tool to get there. Unfortunately, I don't think that the path forward is that clear and that well laid out. And I think it's sort of foolish to sort of imagine that we can just sort of crunch all these numbers and then we just use this tool. We also need the cost effectiveness measure to help us monitor how Empower is stacking up compared to other alternatives to reduce carbon emissions. I'm quite sure that regulators and policymakers really want to understand that. And so I think having a marginal cost of abatement, if that's the sort of the way to go forward, that's only for the electric sector, I think that would be kind of a mistake, because I think, I mean, at a minimum, Empower also affects the gas utility sector, but it really is clearly seen by policymakers as a tool to at least affect the buildings sector. And frankly, if it's much cheaper to abate carbon in Empower than it is to electrify trains, then I think that you want to understand that, and you probably don't want to electrify the trains if you don't need to. So that's sort of a smaller point. But I think it's helpful to think about this cost effectiveness test as helping achieve a policy, but also providing a feedback mechanism, because we don't actually have a perfect lens on where all the carbon reductions need to come from and what they will cost. Thanks.
That all makes sense, Dylan. I wouldn't disagree with anything you said. And to be clear, I don't think there's any one right answer to the question of which method makes the most sense. It's conditional, or the answer is conditional. The only thing I'll really quickly respond to is the point you made about, well, gosh, trying to forecast, 5-10 years into the future, what is going to cost to reduce emissions. If you think that's hard, try forecasting what the damage of this is to the climate, to the globe. So I just want to be careful that we don't assume that estimating abatement costs is somehow less certain or more difficult. I would argue it's actually more certain and less difficult if you have the resources to do it.
I totally agree with that. I cannot imagine sort of anyone sort of differing that as much uncertainty there is about the economics of technologies that it's an easier choice. My point is not that it's hard compared to a social cost of carbon, but that you will get it wrong. Any predictions you make today about the cost of abatement over the next 5, 10, 30 years, you will be wrong. Sure. And the question is, have you built tools in order to correct your course and to be able to achieve the lowest cost carbon reductions as that goes along? And I think that's really all my point is, which is don't think that you know what all the costs are and what all of the resources are. You can hire McKinsey to do a supply curve. That's great. But build a toolbox that helps you manage that over time.
Agreed. And I think that gets to two things. One is the question that Judge McLean asked earlier about, do you need to update these assumptions periodically? And the answer is absolutely, because your understanding will change over time. By the way, just as our understanding of the social cost of carbon will change over time. And secondly, it really points to value in starting to look at the range of distributed resources and other greenhouse gas emission reduction resources together, and not always in silos.
Okay, if I call myself Judge?
Well, hold on. Somebody's in front of you, Joe.
Oh, okay.
It's all right. In the chat, how often do you adjust the marginal abatement cost? And within the energy efficiency context, would you set it for each DSM cycle?
I don't know there's any one right answer to that question. I do think you should update it periodically, just like you should update avoided costs for energy and capacity and T&D periodically. Again, in New England, we do this every 3 years. That seems about right. But if you have a 4-year cycle or a 5-year cycle for planning, or a 3-year cycle, it might make sense to try to do it consistent with those cycles. I think you guys have a 3-year cycle, right? Yeah, so that makes sense.
Right now we do. Yes, sir. Okay. And within the energy efficiency context, would you set it for each DSM cycle?
Yeah, that would make sense if this was being done just for energy efficiency.
Okay.
Again, I think there's value in thinking about this across a range of resources. But if we were talking about narrowly within the context of just energy efficiency, that would make sense.
All right. Thank you, sir. All right, Joe.
So, Chris, I think I've said it different ways. So I'm going to say it again because I'm keying off of something you said in response to Dylan. And that is, if you think there's an uncertainty with marginal abatement cost, what about the social cost of carbon, right? All sorts of uncertainties with that. You know, who the EPA or when the IWG updates its numbers in January, who knows? It's anybody's guess what it's going to be. We all predict it's going to be higher numbers, but you know, who knows? But I don't see how the marginal abatement cost avoids that uncertainty. All that uncertainty is inside the marginal abatement cost, because if, for example, let's say the interagency working group has some sort of huge revelation and decides that the social cost of carbon is 0 in January, well, then the marginal abatement cost is going to be 0 too. And if they just, well, there would be no reason to do any abatement. Why would you have any abatement?
That's a different issue. If the state is committed to reducing its emissions by X amount, and or if one were to say that our social obligation as a state is to reduce our emissions to net zero by 2050, the cost of getting there is the cost of getting there. Whether that's a good policy choice might be influenced by the question of what the social cost of carbon is. But that's a separate question.
I have a hard time divorcing them, because it seems to me that if the social cost of carbon goes to 0, maybe Maryland will take a year to do it, but you know, at some point they're going to, you know, if there's any consensus built around that, then they're going to, you know, the policy is going to go to 0. And so I just don't see how they're separate, and how an argument for marginal abatement, use of marginal abatement costs, can point to less uncertainty. It seems like it's a step beyond all the it's an additional step beyond all the uncertainty associated with the social cost of carbon.
But Joe, are you suggesting that the state policy is about what the carbon reduction should be is driven by the federal government's declaration about what the social cost of carbon is?
Well, I think that the federal government social cost of carbon reflects, well, if you're asking, did the Maryland Assembly do a big analysis and take the social cost of carbon and say what their discount rate is and all that? No, that's not how the political system or policy works. It is more.
Don't you think we should be taking those state policies sort of as the targets for carbon reduction, regardless of variation?
Yeah, so I'm fine with that. I'm totally fine with that. That's why I call it, I'd say just back into it if you're going to do that. What my problem is for marginal abatement, the marginal abatement costs are a function of that state policy, which is a function of your assumptions about your discount rate and a function of your assumptions about the damages to carbon.
Yes, I don't think I would disagree with that. I just think we're sort of exporting the hard choices to the policymakers, and we're just taking the carbon reductions and saying, okay, we're going to use these.
That's right.
Can you explain again, when you said just take those targets and then back them in or back them out? Can you just explain that again, what you mean by that? Because I don't understand quite how that's different from an abatement cost kind of driven approach.
Oh, I think it's very similar. In fact, I'm saying if you're going to use a marginal abatement cost approach, why not just do that?
So can you explain it again? What you're saying? Yeah.
Oh, just say, okay, so let's say that we decide that the policy is that Empower is going to, have these 2% reductions per annum consistent with the past, plus they're going to be a beneficial electrification component due to rebates for heat pumps.
Yeah.
And so that's what is prescribed for Empower. And then you go figure, okay, well, this is what you got to do. And so how much do you got to spend to do it? And
so you're saying a goal setting exercise. You're saying just pick the goal of Empower based on that. And then you don't need to worry about,
it's a little
well, you can back into a cost of carbon from that. You back back into it with a combination of your assumptions about cost of carbon, discount rates, all sorts of whatever factors go into it. But the point is that you build your cost effectiveness regime ex ante to get you to whatever that objective is. And then
going forward, you use that same cost effectiveness regime ex post so that you're not penalizing utilities or whoever for, assumptions made in a very uncertain world. And so, I mean, to some extent, I mean, I think that's the extreme version of what Jim Gravatt has been arguing. The challenge is then figuring out what exactly that policy is.
Yeah.
Because we don't have the specifics.
Right. Got it. I would agree with that. Okay. That's, I mean, I think that is certain, that does have a certain appeal. I would agree with that. And I think that the question is, do we really know? Just because they, the MDE kind of modeled Empower at the 2% status quo. I mean, I think it would take quite a lot of work, and maybe we would not have any net reduction in controversy to have to say, well, what should that goal be? I mean, and that's the goal setting exercise that has, even though we have a goal framework that we may have agreed on, I think we still have a lot of work to do on how that goal setting happens. I
mean, there's one I think fault with going with that method is that to the best of my knowledge, and maybe people from MDE can correct me on this, but I don't think that MDE has done any Empower level analysis to look at the marginal abatement of costs associated with Empower, to know where Empower goes in the rank ordering of all the abatement resources that are out there. And so there's been basically, I think it was pretty blunt, look, we've been doing 2%, you can continue doing that. And then that we all, at least the people in this room, all know that there's some big question marks around that, at least at the current marginal abatement cost. If you did that number for Empower historically, I think that marginal abatement cost for Empower is going to be much higher going forward. And there could be some new low-hanging fruit or something that happens, that rocks our world. But, as lighting goes away, we got, some big challenges in terms of the cost.
Joe, let me say one thing real quick in response to your kind of extreme example of what if the feds find there's no benefit to greenhouse gas emission reductions. Think about it from the other end. What if they find that it's worth $1,000 a ton? Would that mean that it would make sense to invest in all efficiency measures that are cost effective at $1,000 a ton, when our own studies presumably would tell us that anything above $150 a ton doesn't make sense because we can substitute wind and solar and storage instead?
No, and I don't think that's the case. So I agree with you on that. I think it's I think it's kind of an unlikely scenario, but I wasn't pointing in one direction or the other with I was just saying that uncertainty is everywhere, was my main point. Agreed.
I was just making the point that, and again, this is just a conceptual point, that the abatement cost method tells you the level at which you should be willing to invest in energy efficiency or any other resource relative to the alternatives for decarbonizing the state.
But that's what it doesn't tell us yet. So if we do it with our current method, using California standard practice methodology, we include a marginal abatement cost as our, basically our adder for GHG. We are not putting it in as a rank ordering. We're saying as long as it has a benefit cost that exceeds 1, then it screens. But all that means is that it's could be $1 less than the most expensive abatement resource. And it's not saying that we should be doing it now. It's, we may not have done 100 other things that are cheaper than that last resource yet, but we're going to go ahead and do energy efficiency because it's less expensive than the last resource we would ever do given the current policy. And
right, but if you have to do all of those resources, including the last one, in order to get to the target, it doesn't matter whether you do the third most expensive before the fourth most expensive, because you have to do both.
But that's the bold assumption there. That assumes that you're certain about what your ultimate goal is going to be. If there's uncertainty about that, about the value of the social cost of carbon, if the social cost of carbon goes down, then the marginal abatement cost goes down as well. And so we would be comparing, to the most expensive resource is what we're going to compare to, rather than what the next what the next best resource is or something, right?
Yeah, that's only true if you believe that there's uncertainty about whether the state needs to decarbonize its economy. If you don't think there's significant uncertainty about that, then that question goes away.
I think there is significant uncertainty, and here's the uncertainty. It's not whether we need to. It's whether we need to reduce by 50% by 2040 or whatever the current goal is, or something double twice that, right? Whether we need to get to
Right.
net zero by 2040. That could be, 5 years from now, as fast as things are moving in the world, 5 years from now, we could be on a whole different trajectory. Or we could discover that, you can go out and, electrify the oceans, and you got a whole new carbon sink, right? There's all sorts of stuff being discussed, and so, and thus the urgency is gone, right? Who knows what'll happen. And I'm not saying I agree with electrification of the ocean. Please don't take that away from here. But it's the uncertainty, the notion that the Maryland State Assembly has declaimed right now, its goal, and that there's not uncertainty around that based on assumed costs of social cost of carbon and assumed, what's available to deal with it. It seems to me is, I don't know. I think there's a lot of uncertainty.
Well, we could probably debate this ad nauseum.
We could,
but I guess I'll just make this final statement, and then you can get the last word, Joe.
Nope, you can have it.
I think there's a heck of a lot less uncertainty about the need to get close to net zero, if not at net zero, in order to stabilize the climate over the next 20, 25 years, than there is about the social cost of carbon.
All right. Cindy.
I just wanted to, this is Cindy Osordo with the Maryland Department of the Environment. Just wanted to second Chris's comments just now. Yeah, I hear the concern that there's a lot of uncertainty, and in a perfect world, we would have interim targets, and we would have a crystal ball to predict the perfect amount of algorithm that is needed for the implementation of the GGR8, but we do not have that just yet.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Anybody else want to weigh in on Chris's presentation or Joe's comments?
I would like to thank you, Chris, for coming up with a presentation so quickly, since yesterday or whatever when we talked about this. So, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Glad to. And again, this can get lost in these kind of back and forth discussions. I just want to be clear. I don't think there's any one perfect answer to this question. And ultimately, the choice you make needs to be a practical one, as well as a kind of defensible one on principle. And I think there are multiple potential solutions that could be argued to meet both of those criteria.
All right,
Chris, I'm sorry, Judge. Chris, Chris, are you able to stay on for a while longer?
Yes.
Or what's your schedule today? Okay.
Yep.
All right. Dylan, you seemed like you wanted a little bit more time to think about this. Is that fair to say?
If Nicole's on, Your Honor, she can talk a little bit about where OPC.
Okay.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
So we do believe in general that a significantly higher value for carbon will be necessary in order to meet the state's greenhouse goal greenhouse gas reduction targets. We don't currently have a specific value to suggest at this point. And we also don't have a firm position at this point as to whether the value of greenhouse gas emissions should be based on a social cost or a marginal cost of abatement. And we do realize there are pros and cons with each. In some ways, we think the marginal cost of abatement would be easier, but the question is whether we can get reliable Maryland-specific data. And social cost of carbon is also reasonable, but right now we're kind of waiting to see what this federal interagency work group is coming up with. So at this point, those are our thoughts, but we don't have a firm position on this.
All right, very good. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Anybody else before we
Judge?
move on? Yes.
Judge, can I propose, I sent a spreadsheet out just before the meeting that I have a table that we could walk through that lays out inventories. Dylan actually suggested that I do it, that lays out the decisions that we have related to the emissions benefit. And then also, I've started, and it gives some columns for people to put in their, opinions, and we could even real time calculate what the emissions benefit would be based on people's, opinions, if people were, wanted to do that. I'm wondering whether that would be an exercise that would be useful at this juncture.
If now's the best time to do it, I would say yeah, and I am for anything for moving us forward and making decisions. So
yeah, that's what I'm.
So if this will help, even if we can't agree on something, if we at least have 2 or 3 thoughts, I'm fine with it.
And I think it will. I can. I have some responses to Nicole, but I think I'd rather we can discuss it in this bigger context. Don't smile just because I always have responses. But okay, if I share, I'm going to share my.
Go ahead, please.
Screen. Let's see, a window. I think this is the one I'm looking for. Yeah. So just reminding you before we've had discussion around this might look familiar. We've, this is from last meeting. We walked through a bunch of different issues. And so what I've done, and then we have a summary sheet that gives the criteria emission or the GHG emissions associated with those different decisions and the criteria emissions and then the totals. So we've updated these per different discussions, just trying to make it relevant and where we could be responsive to what we see as the most likely decisions and discussions. And so I would like to walk through these decisions again real quickly, or as quickly as I can. And then I've provided my recommendation and why, and then I would encourage others, all the other stakeholders, and I just listed who I think are the key ones, to do the same. Ultimately, we're all going to have to make recommendations and decisions, about this to be able to get to consensus, or even to get to realize that we don't have a consensus. So the first, and people feel free to jump in as I go through this. So the first topic is how we calculate GHG emissions reductions. So we got a megawatt hour reduction from an Empower program. How do we calculate the emissions associated with that? In terms of the boundary for the GHG emissions reductions, we have data for Maryland associated with Maryland consumption. So where the generation is occurring for Maryland megawatt hours. And so I don't think there's controversy there, but let me know if there is, because the alternative would be to use generation from PJM or something, right? But we have data showing what generation's associated with Maryland. The second is what's the unloading method. This gets to, or Nicole was talking about the average versus marginal emissions rates. So there's a couple options there. We can use we could use the MDE numbers for GHG. The MDE emissions intensities are average, and they don't have we don't have a marginal number from MDE. There's also a PJM average number that we could use. There's also the PJM average marginal, and then there's the EPA avert, which is a marginal number. So the EPA avert is using is going, as I described before, is modeling the specific generation that's operating at the times and places where the energy efficiency is occurring, and then saying this is the marginal resource that would be backed out. So if you reduced your consumption by a small amount, what generation is no longer going to be running. And so that's different than the MDE numbers or the PJM numbers, which are what is the emissions intensity at various times. And so rather than the EPA is different, it's saying what would you actually take out. So I'll just say what my recommendation is as I go down here. So I would use the EPA avert. It's specifically driven towards energy efficiency. And as the portfolios are, currently designed. So it takes into account your base load and your seasonal load measures, and looks at a typical portfolio. Then the forecasting method is the next choice. We got, and by the way, there could be other options. I'm putting the ones that I think are on the table, but feel free as we go through here to say that there's something that I'm missing here. But in terms of on these GHG emissions intensities, we have points in time from EPA avert or PJM. For forecasting, we need to figure out, for the life of our Empower measures, which some are as long, I think, 25 years is about the longest measure. We need to figure out how we're going to forecast those emissions intensities. And so I think these are the ones that are on the table. One is to use the EPA avert, but then ratio over time using the MDE policy case. That will have a relatively rapid decline in emissions intensity due to decarbonization of the grid that is proposed by MDE and legislated. MDE also has a reference case, which still has a decline in carbon or emissions intensity, but it's a slower decline, and that's basically what would happen, but for the MDE policies. And then the other EIA, the Energy Information Administration Annual Energy Outlook, does projections on these kind of things all the time, and they have an forecast not only for GHG, also for criteria emissions. This is probably the most commonly used, I think, to date. If you look around at other jurisdictions, most use the EIA AEO. And then finally, there's avert. Avert has numbers every 5. There's 3 5-year numbers or something. You could just trend off those numbers. And my recommendation on that would be use the MDE policy case. I'm actually agnostic between the MDE policy case or the reference case. It really depends on how fast you think the grid is going to decarbonize. And so I could see using I could see using either of those also, and then adjusting as you go forward. If the MDE policy case, you get 5 years out and you realize none of that policy has actually happened, or get 3 years out, you might say, okay, well, none of that policy actually happened, and then you make adjustments. So I could see a number of different ways to do it. But for right now, because ultimately, if we don't make a decision, somebody else is going to make it for us, I would propose the MDE policy case. And then in terms of the time-based emissions, my recommendation, we could do it now. We could go wrestle that animal to the ground. It's going to be I don't think we really have time for it, especially given that we want to move into the NEBS world, or other NEBS. So I would propose that we do it later as part of the evaluation advisory group. And the reason is that I don't think it's going to would have a big effect on our goal or potential study, overall at the overall portfolio level emissions. But I do think it's important for portfolio design, and that we should do it, just not right now. Criteria emissions reductions. Our decisions we need to make our boundary. I get the same response here as I do for GHG. We have good data on the emissions coming from generation plants that are providing electricity to Maryland consumers, and so we should use that. The order of unloading. In this case, I would also use the EPA avert for this for the same reasons, and that the models are actually looking specifically at energy efficiency programs and specifically looking at what would get backed out of the system that we don't get from the MDE or from, well, MDE doesn't even have criteria emissions numbers. We don't get that from the PJM. They just tell us what happened at a point in time, what the emissions intensity were at a point in time, not what would happen if you backed out some consumption. In terms of the forecasting method, in here, in this case, I would use the EIA AEO, and in part because it's a source that's been around for a long time. It's most commonly used for criteria emissions. We don't have an MDE criteria emissions numbers. If we did, in fact, Cindy, if that's we've asked for that from the Towson folks, but we haven't gotten anything, and so I'm not sure it's available. But that would be specifically for energy efficiency programs. So if we can get it, something that corresponds with the MDE case, and by that what I mean is MDE has for GHG projected out, what the emissions will be in the policy case and in a reference case. And so there's with that is associated certain generation resources that they, then go and calculate what their GHG emissions are. You could, if you knew what those generation assumptions were from that MDE used to get its GHG emissions intensities, you could, I think, pretty readily go in and figure out what the SOx, NOx, and PM 2.5 criteria emissions are, at least. But until we get that, until we have that level of data from the detailed data from MDE, then I propose that we would go with the EIA AEO. And similarly here for time-based criteria emissions, I think it's important, but I would hold off on it. On other emissions reductions, we have methane, I think, has probably been the one that most commonly comes up. The challenge with methane is we're talking reductions in methane leaks from transmission and distribution pipelines and from production facilities and from end use equipment. The big question mark is to what extent. Well, I can pretty much, I'm pretty confident that methane emissions from those kind of leaks are not proportional to reductions in throughput in the system. And they could be on a whole, like if you had one pipeline and you were able through an efficiency program to shut down that pipeline, no longer have any natural gas coming through that pipeline, then obviously you have a proportional reduction in leaks from that pipeline. But generally we're talking about incremental reductions in throughput in those pipelines. And so there could be some pressure, I just don't know what the factors are that the pressurization factors or whatever that drive those leaks. I've got calls and emails out to old friends in pretty high places asking them to get data together, but so far nobody's sent me anything. And I've Googled several times on this, just trying to find anything that touches this topic, and I don't see it. So I want to be clear. I think there's a huge damage cost associated with, sorry, it's somebody at the door, 1 second. So I've got, I have to get somebody else to answer the door for me. Give me 1 second. All right, sorry about that. So I'm not, I want to be clear, I'm not in any way arguing that those emissions, let's see, where was I? I'm not in any way arguing that methane emissions are not important. I think they're hugely important, and they are a big focus of the administration and everyone now, and rightly so. The question is whether, to what extent the methane emissions reductions occur as a result of the efficiency programs. I have the same, in terms of calculating the emissions reductions from the programs, the same issues with the nitrous oxides, which are, by the way, now the social cost of carbon tables report social cost associated with carbon or CO2, methane, and nitrous oxides. And so those numbers are readily available from the IWG social cost of carbon, sheets. But figuring out what the emissions reductions are resulting from efficiency programs, I think, is the big challenge. Likewise with refrigerants and sulfur hexafluoride, sulfur FX6, by the way, associated with transmission transformers. It's basically a lubricant, I think, and these things have huge global warming potential. A 410A as a refrigerant, which is the most commonly used refrigerant right now, is has global warming potential of that's 60 times carbon or something like that. It's just really really big, and SF6 even more. So I think they're really big. They have really big impacts. Those on global warming. The challenge here that I'm kind of throwing out to everyone is what effect do the Empower programs have on those emissions? Down to the valuation of those various emissions, the carbon, methane, and nitrous oxides, as I said, they're all readily available from the Interagency Working Group. I've got a criteria. I'm just going to ask my house to be a little more quiet here. So I think we got good numbers on those. They're readily available. They're frequently used. In fact, I don't really see anybody really using any other numbers. There's good documentation in the Interagency Working Group talking about how they value those emissions. They basically, if you look at the technical worksheets, I could show it to you if anybody's interested. Basically they're doing a bunch of model runs and then taking and then looking at the distributions of the results from those model runs, and then coming up with point estimates at different discount rates. And so it's certainly more robust analysis of emissions damages than I have the bandwidth or even the knowledge to do. Criteria boundary. Let's see. I would use for the GHG boundary. I didn't even include it on here because I haven't heard anyone in this context suggest we should be using anything less than a global boundary for GHG emissions. And so I didn't even include it here. If people want me to add a row, I can do that. For the criteria boundary, we could use, and I actually should add that, we could use global. Sorry, I'm going to add this while we're talking here. We could have a global, a PJM, a Maryland. There are different options here, and I'm just going to write PJM, and people could come up with something besides these. But and my recommendation on this is that we use a global. I have the same. It's hard in terms of the global using a global social cost of carbon. When I go look at the technical worksheets and when they talk about this topic, I use global rather than a US or something else. They start using words like truly. This is a truly global, issue or something like that, right? And whenever I start seeing truly in technical papers, I start going, okay, well, what I get a little suspicious. But where they make the most compelling argument that they make in the technical documents is that basically you can't get an economically efficient outcome if you only look at U.S. GHG emissions, or if you only look at Maryland GHG emissions. Everyone, if they were making their decisions on that basis, only what are the damages to Maryland from greenhouse gas from a ton of GHG, Maryland would never do anything on greenhouse gas reductions. And so that's ultimately the argument. That's the only real substantive argument. Besides, I saw years ago some stuff from they were citing Kip Viscusi and some other economists. This is in the 2013 or whatever technical support documents. Arguing for reciprocity and altruism, and that's why you take a global view. So on criteria emissions, several people have said to me, "Oh, criteria emissions are local. Why would we do a global criteria emissions boundary?" I fundamentally disagree with that premise. There would not be a Clean Air Act if criteria emissions were local, a federal Clean Air Act, from back in the 70s. If the criteria emissions were local, just look, it doesn't. You don't have to look. Well, we just know that emissions coming into Maryland are coming from largely when our air quality is bad in DC. It's usually because of coal emissions in the Ohio Valley, or it's coming from outside of the state. And if you looked at, say, at the PJM or the U.S. states or whatever, if you looked at each state only counts the damage is associated with their generation to people in Maryland, right? So we're only going to say that the emissions that land on the heads of people in Maryland count, and we're going to base our decisions on that. You would not take much action. In fact, you might not take any. And if every state in the PJM did the same thing, you would every state would not take any action, or would take much less action than otherwise. It's exactly, in my mind, synonymous or analogous, whatever, with the argument for a GHG global boundary. So that's my pitch there. I know this is one of the bigger points of contention, I think, still hanging out there. So I made my piece. Other people can make their piece when they put their arguments in the columns, if I can get them to. And then I would use EPA COBRA for criteria emissions costing evaluation. It's a publicly available source, a lot of documentation associated with it. It's peer reviewed, and this is what everybody uses, or I shouldn't say everybody, but it's hard to find a study that's not using COBRA if they're doing criteria emissions evaluation. I would here's getting to the discussion this morning. This is avoided damages. I've also got the same list for marginal abatement costs. I'll throw out one more question to the marginal abatement cost advocates, which is kind of embedded in my table here. And that is, if we decided we were doing marginal abatement cost for GHG, what are we going to do for criteria emissions and or refrigerants in SF6? In that case, we use a marginal abatement for GHG, and then we use avoided damages for criteria emissions. And I'm not opining there, just saying that would be a question that we would, I don't know if there's any reason why they need to both be one or the other, but probably not. But
Hey, Joe.
Yeah, Chris.
Are you intending to still be showing your screen?
Yes, I am.
You're
Am I
not.
the only one who's not seeing it?
Uh-oh.
I think he took it away to edit, and you never put it back up.
I didn't even know I could take it away to edit. Let me see where I'm. See if I got the right one. I got too many things up. All right. Okay. Well, basically what I've been doing is just going down. I sent the spreadsheet decisions sheet that I sent out earlier today. Hopefully people have been able to keep up with me. I can talk y'all through anything again if you want. So I am now down through the emissions reductions calculations into the avoided damages, and I've provided my recommendations for criteria and GHG. I was just talking about how the marginal abatement, we could, rather than value emissions using avoided damages, using marginal abatement costs. And then the question what is where we get a model for GHG. We're not even clear on that yet, but we would also, I guess, need something for criteria emissions and other. But I don't know, Chris, you may have an opinion on that. if we used say marginal abatement cost for GHG, that would not prescribe us from using avoided damages for criteria emissions or using COBRA for criteria, right?
I don't think so.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, my recommendations, as you can see here, are not marginal. They're all in the using the avoided damages costs. And then in terms of this last, I'm going to get saving the best for last. Then the second to last is monetized externality costs. Currently, we have gotten estimates. We spent quite a bit of effort on this in this last year, teasing out the RPS compliance cost in the avoided energy costs that the utilities provide, because that's already in our that's already in our total resource cost test. And so when we did our societal test where we're adding in all these externality costs, we wanted to take whatever those externality costs are that are now currently internalized in electric price or electric costs, and subtract that out. And so that's actually a fairly sizable number. It's like $9 a megawatt hour. That's a levelized number, is like $9 a megawatt hour that gets subtracted from our benefit. So the question there, and I really don't know the answer. In fact, I don't know if Cindy or somebody from MDE could maybe ask around about this. We're including this RPS compliance cost. Are there other costs associated with criteria emissions or even RGGI or other things that we should also be netting out that would already, these are basically damage costs that are already internalized in the electric utilities avoided energy costs. And Cindy, I have not sent an email or anything. I can send an email with a specific, ask that question in writing if it would help. But
yeah, I think that would help. I think she dropped off the call.
Okay, I will send her a call. I'll send her a note. So then finally, to probably the big enchiladas, the societal discount rate. So I'm gonna actually have a bit more discussion on that I'm going to turn to in just a second. My recommendation on this, just to finish out this worksheet, is that we go with the 2%. And my reason for that is that the federal government, in terms of its lower discount rate, its societal discount rate, is going to be going to that number in the near. Or I'll explain why I'm saying that, but I guess I'll strongly infer from my reading and perusal of the various federal government documents and stuff that that it's that 3% that is currently on the books is going to go to 2% probably in January. And I'm not sure, and I'm also going to make an argument for why I don't think we should just do whatever the feds do. But I think people were this group seemed to be headed for a 1%. There was some sticker shock in particular associated with the social cost of carbon at a 1% discount rate. A 2% discount rate if you gives you $60 emissions benefit rather than a $300 emissions benefit. So I think that would be more acceptable. So what I've done here, or what Christine did for me here, was take my recommendation in column H and then calculate the GHG emissions benefit if you went with those assumptions, the criteria emissions benefit if you went with those assumptions, and then what the total emissions benefit would be, which is if you did everything as I say here, you would have $116 per megawatt hour emissions benefit. In other words, that'd be almost 11.6 cents per kilowatt hour.
Joe, excuse me, can you just flip to the summary and tell me which scenario corresponds to your that recommendation?
You know why I can? Because I can just look at 116.28. It's this one.
Okay. So 9.
Number 9.
Thank you.
Number 9.
Magic.
So and what we're trying to do is set this up where so that was, you got to hear, I'll meet me opine, but who cares what I think. If we go across to the right, I just set up columns for OPC and MIA, the joint utilities, non-joint utilities, in case some of the one or more utilities don't join a joint utility. Recommendation, staff recommendation, Cadmus, Sammy, Oracle with Julia, and Ceres with Marin. And then, I'm sure there's others that I, in my haste early this morning, did not include here. But my recommendation is either now, I would like, I'd, love to do the exercise right now after I give you a little bit of information on discount rates. It'd be great if we could go all walk through here and at least give our gut reactions. I got a feeling, that may not happen, but I will offer it up again in a minute. I'm going to now go to, if you're working from the worksheet I sent this morning, if you go to the topics. Uh-oh. Actually, somehow this morning, I think I moved my topics into there. So I'm going to have to do this from an email. In fact, if y'all just give me 1 second, I'm sending an email to all of you that has what I thought I had put in the spreadsheet. So if you give me just 1 second, sorry about that. Okay, this should come in an email. I'm going to just attach it to the email I sent this morning. I'm going to reply all, and it should be in your inboxes momentarily. Hopefully I didn't make some big mistake and send you my bank account. You'll know that I'm overdrawn. Let's see. Can somebody just tell me, that you've got it, or whenever it comes in?
I just got it.
Okay. Let's see. I'm going to stop sharing that other spreadsheet for now. I'm going to go to this so I can walk through it. Judge, are you okay with the pace, or other people okay with the pace here?
Pace is good. I'll give you a warning. I'm probably going to have to stop around 12:15-ish. So we're just playing for lunch around 12:15 to 12:45-ish. So
okay.
All right.
I think what I'm going to do is just share my whole screen. That way I can find stuff. I have to do this, go through all this. All right, you're about to see my whole life. My whole life is about to flash before your eyes. Okay, here's the email I just sent. So I'm going to talk through a couple issues, but most of my focus here, this is just, I've just been trying to go dig out based on discussions that we've had over the last week. We've had these 1 hour, sometimes they went, to 2 hours sessions each day, Friday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, where people called in for Q&A. Usually people just kind of wanted me to walk through stuff again for them. So we did a lot of that, but had a lot of good discussion along the way. So in the process, I've got a bit of a feel for where people were kind of thinking, so I've gone and dug around to check on some of these things. So on the criteria emissions boundary, this is on the actually it's the emissions economic boundary. This is not the emissions intensity boundary. That's the Maryland state line for intensity, but for the economic boundary, this is I pulled this from the IWG technical document for the global social cost of carbon. And let me just read it. The IWG found previously and is restating here that because of this distinctive global nature of climate change, that analysis of federal regulatory and other actions should center on a global measure of GHG. This approach is the same as that taken in regulatory analyses over 2009 through 2016. So they're leaning on precedent. And in the 2015 response to comments, the IWG noted that the only way to achieve an efficient allocation of resources for emissions reductions on a global basis is for all countries to base their policies on global estimates of damages. Therefore, the IWG continues to recommend the use of global social cost GHG estimates and analysis of federal regulatory and other actions. And so the reason I'm highlighting that is what I already said, is that I don't see how the argument for criteria emissions is any different than that. That you have, the only way to achieve an efficient allocation of resources for criteria emissions reductions is for all states to base their policy on, global estimates of damages. And so I know that I'm trying to directly address the arguments that, criteria emissions are local and we therefore should treat them different than GHG. Well, that's all I'll say there. By the way, I just noted here also the EV work group, along the way, last night I went and checked the final document, and they did assume global economic boundaries for GHG and criteria emissions. Discount rates. So I think Sheldon and I had talked, Sheldon has talked about, why don't we just lean on whatever the feds do? That's what we'll do. What are the feds using for discount rate? So, he and I both were, kind of gathered around. It's 3% seems to be what we've seen in different stuff. But so I went and started, and this is all Google. I didn't talk to anybody, I didn't have time. So this is, basically hours of perusing and trying to figure out what everybody's doing. So this is some stuff that's coming up really on Google. And so I went to see, well, what are the feds using as real discount rates? And my conclusion is they're using everything from minus 1.8%. And I have a shout out to Sammy, since Sammy in the last meeting or meeting before said in his dissertation or his master's thesis or something that he had made a case for negative discount rates. Well, they are in fact, I've got documents showing, and these are recent documents saying that's what you should use. And then, so it's somewhere between minus 1.8% and 7%. And then and so I just collecting different stuff here, U.S. Department of Transportation continues to use a 7% discount rate. And in fact, I went looking for what discount rates are being used for Maryland analyses and was having a hard time finding any Maryland analyses. So anybody can send them to me, please do, that were online. But the Maryland Department of Transportation is also using a 7% discount rate. OMB Circular A4 from 2003, so during the Bush administration, actually went through and thought about discount rates and wrote out, and gave 2 discount rates that agencies should use. And they're based on these 2. I'm not going to read all this out to you, but I wanted to provide it in case people are interested. There's also links, by the way, to all these documents in this email. But the 7% is based on an opportunity cost of capital. And so that's the rate of, if the federal government is going to take, money away from, take money out of the private sector, what is the rate of return that you would have expected if that money had been invested in capital? I would say that this is fairly, this would be really our weighted average cost of capital is pretty close to this number in Maryland. And so I've seen this, so that's one way. That's how they got to the 7%. They say it's probably a little lower now in some of the more recent documents, but it's, it's not, again, our weighted average cost of capital is probably equivalent. So that's one federal discount rate used for social, used for a societal discount rate. The other is the social rate of time preference. As I understand this one, this is really what I've seen characterized as the normative version. Sorry, I gotta get quiet in here. I can't move. My problem is I can't move, everybody, because I get too far from my router. So the opportunity, so the social rate of time preference is looking at really what consumers would have, what would consumers discount rate would be as on average over, across everybody. And it's a little confusing to me because I always think of consumers, at least at the individual level, could have much higher discount rates. But if people are willing, basically what they use is a 30-year average for a 10-year treasury rate, which right now is negative. But they say, I'm sorry, buddy, I've got to go tell these guys to take it easy here. All right. Sorry about that. Did I stop presenting? Y'all can still see my screen, right?
We can.
Okay. So I think the message and there's no clear right answer. I can't find in the literature. In fact, I'll show you an article that is out there that's very good. Well, actually, the one I got here. If anyone wants to see a good discussion, it's actually from the late 90s. And it's this judicial review down here, Edward Morrison. And so that was looking at how different agencies are doing discount rates and trying to find rhyme or reason. And basically his conclusion was, pretty stark. And that is, there ain't no rhyme or reason. Everybody's just doing, whatever they want to do. And they're not even, in many cases, feeling the need to say why they're doing it. And so that's where I think I've characterized discount rate determination as being largely a religious endeavor. And I think I'm still there. But I frankly was surprised to not be able to find any sort of commonality in the federal government on discount rate. And so even this, because this OMB circular is still referenced. So that's what they're actually talking when we talk about changes that might occur to the discount rate in the near future. It would be going, and at least one thing that would happen, I think, will be that the Biden administration will go recalculate these two numbers. So the 7%, from what I see, could go down a little bit, is how it's characterized. 3%, the 3% discount rate that's based on the 30-year average of 10-year treasury rates will probably go down below to 2% at least. And I actually did the calculation here. Let me just see where I put that so I can remind myself. Well, I'm sorry, I don't see where I wrote it. But anyway, I did the calculation. It's in the spreadsheet that I sent this morning on the last tab, where I went and looked at the most recent 30-year, looked at 10-year treasury rates going back 30 years, took that average, and then took the average CPI inflation rate over that same period and subtracted that from that average. And I got I think it was 1.6%. So if the administration goes and does the same method that was used previously for this social rate of time preference, they're going to end up with a number that's, probably 1.6% or something like that. That would be my guess. And they may just land on 2%. And one reason why I could argue for 1.8%. The one challenge with that is for social cost of carbon. That's challenging going and figuring out what that number is. But here was probably the most, interesting discussion that I saw of all was the Army Corps of Engineers, and they gave multiple discount rates for different types of functions. For our purposes, they said some interesting stuff in here. So they calculated the discount rate based on this method I'm talking about, going and using 30-year treasury rates. But there's some this last sentence is key. According to law, the rate may not be raised or lowered more than 1/4 of 1 percentage point in any year. So even though their average would be lower than 2.5%, which is what they're using as their latest discount rate, the only reason it's not lower than that is because they can't change it by more than this 1/4%, 1/4 of a 1 percentage point. So, and then finally, and again, these are all linked. The OMB Circular A94, which is kind of supplemental to the A4, it was revised November 2020. It says a forecast. Okay, right. Forecast real interest rates from the inflation premium have been removed based on the economic assumptions from 22 budget. These real rates are to be used for discounting constant dollar flows, as is often required in cost effectiveness analysis. Right. This is Office of Management budget coming from the White House. November 2020 is before the current administration, but I think the administration is probably going low interest rates as well. Real interest rates, and of course, these are being done for budget purposes, which there's all sorts of interest in having low discount rates when you're doing your budgeting. Real interest rates on treasury notes and bonds of specified maturities, 3-year minus 1.8%, 5-year minus 1.6%. Those are not hyphens, those are negatives. 7-year minus 1.4%, 10-year minus 1. So it's saying, go figure out what your, in our case, we're probably looking, in terms of a weighted average useful life of the Empower programs is over 6.2 years currently. So we would be looking maybe at the 7-year number. So we'd be looking at minus 1.4% for the Empowered discount rate, if you keyed off of this. So there's their suggested reading. I think my bottom line or my takeaways from all this is, we're not, unfortunately, Sheldon, we're not going to be able to just go pick a number from the feds. We can, and arguably somebody could even say, well, why are we talking 3%? We should be talking weighted average cost of capital. And that is used in some jurisdictions. And that would be, I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying that would coincide with that 7%. Or if you were comfortable with this social rate of time preference, the 3% that was developed in 2003 based on treasury rates occurring from 1973 to 2003, then if that's, if you support that principle, then we should adjust that number to reflect 10-year treasury rates from 2021 back to 1991.
All right, Joe, you got a question from Sheldon, and then
Sure.
Chris after that.
Hey, Sheldon.
Joe, can you go back up to the boundary part of your
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I just want to get a little clarification. With respect to criteria emissions, that quote that you have, was that explicitly mentioned as with respect to criteria emissions, or are you just saying that principle should apply?
Yeah, no. Okay. So this one is a quote from the IWG related to GHG emissions.
Okay.
This down here, I'm sorry. That is a quote. That's quoting me. I meant to take that
Okay.
quotation mark right there should not be there.
Yeah, I just want to know, and I'm okay. So basically, the IWG did not say necessarily that this principle should apply to criteria emissions.
They didn't say it should apply to anything. They were only talking about GHG emissions. I'm arguing that there's no difference. That there's functionally no difference.
Understood.
I don't see if you agree with this, which is the only substantive reason I see that the IWG has made, besides the distinctive global nature, right? It's the only substantive argument I've seen for using a global boundary for GHG. So if you subscribe to that, I would be interested to hear why you would not subscribe to it for criteria.
And I can't say I'm an expert on it, but clearly carbon is a global issue, but particulates typically are more local in effect. And I'd be curious, the two sensitivities I'd like to see, and maybe you have a number you can point to, but what if we used a 2.5% discount rate and also maybe a PJM boundary for criteria?
I'm going to come to that in just a second,
Okay.
Sheldon, and I can't give you a 2.5%. I can give you 1%, 2%, and 3%, looking at all those different scenarios. So
Well, even a 2% with the PJM boundary would be, for criteria would be okay.
You will be able to real time, if you went through that table and picked out what you think is kind of right, you would be able to real time see what your number will be. I'll show you how to do that in just a minute.
Okay, thanks, Joe.
Maryland-based discount rates.
Hold on a sec, Joe. Chris, you still have a question, sir?
Yeah, thanks, Judge. Joe, I just wanted to add one more thought on the extensive set of references and discussions you've had on discount rates, which has to do with risk. While discount rates are really about time preference for money, or principally about time preference for money, I think that's true only if different risk profiles of the resources you're comparing to each other have been monetized. If they haven't, so for example, if we're using our best estimate of avoided energy costs and not a probability weighted estimate of avoided energy costs, then you could also and should also use discount rates to adjust for different risk profiles. And I think generally speaking, the industry tends to use our best estimates of things for energy and capacity and the cost of carbon, and not some probability weighted estimates that account for extremes that may have, modest possibilities, but would weight numbers much higher if there was a probability weighted average. And relative to efficiency and some other distributed resources, if that's the case, that's also a potential conceptual argument for taking whatever discount rate you would otherwise come up with and adjusting it downward.
Yeah, so I at least conceptually agree that a risk weighting is appropriate. I think you and I have had the discussion before that I don't necessarily subscribe to the notion that efficiency programs have less risk in terms of whether you're going to realize the benefits or the costs than other resources. And I think I just have to take it on a case-by-case basis to do that kind of adjustment. But I totally agree that the adjustment is appropriate. We just have to, and I was actually thinking that this would be will be a discussion in the NEBS, that there might be an alternative way to do it would be to have some sort of risk adder or subtractor associated with the programs. But I totally agree with you.
Is that all you got for us, Joe? Or you're muted, Joe.
Yep, sorry about that.
It's okay.
I got a little bit more. If you're okay,
no problem.
So let's see. Going back to my email. So for Maryland, I really couldn't find any anything. I could find 2.5% to 7%. The 2.5% is the EV work group. And the 7% is this Department of Transportation, Maryland Department of Transportation, which I think is just basically leaning on the feds. And then the Daymark study, interestingly, was using the Daymark PV study from PC 44 from 2018 was using 3% for the social cost of carbon and for the criteria emissions, but then using a 5% social cost of carbon to forecast the RGGI price, and then a 7% for transmission deferral. And that was me searching discount rates. I couldn't find any other reference, to what they were doing overall. But it was interesting to me that they were using these different discount rates for these different purposes. And I'm not opining on whether that's appropriate or not. I didn't have time to look at it and think about it. But just noting that there was no clear guidance from PC 44 either. And I don't know if Dan is back on or Michael. But I, from staff, I went and looked in the wind case jacket, and I saw some analysis, I think an ICF analysis, but I couldn't discern what they were using for discount rate. And so I couldn't, I don't know if anybody knows what discount rates were being used for the analyses in the wind case that might be instructive. in terms of discount rates, the trends on the discount rates. So like I said, currently federal 3, and 7. At least on the 3, there's I haven't seen anybody say that those are too low. There seems to be some leaning, at least in our context, on using a 3%, and that should be lower, given the 30-year history of 10-year treasuries. So I suspect it will go. Oh, there's my number. So if I applied the same method, and this discount rate's trending lower, if I applied the same method as was used in 2003 to get 3% discount rate, it would be 1.68% now. And so that's and this is looking at current. Looking at the current. And this is wrong. The second I realized in the middle of the night, forgot to change it. So the real discount rate was based on 1973 to 2003, not 83. So at any rate, I think it's going lower. And I found an interesting article in Wall Street Journal from last March, written by a Harvard professor and a University of Chicago professor, both with lots of titles attached to their names. And they're arguing for a lower discount rate to be used also. And the article was basically not arguing in the context of climate change, although these guys, when I go look at their bios, have some attachment to, but is just more as a an investment for a government investment, that they're saying it should be lower than the 3%. Let's see. And I didn't find, by the way, I wasn't looking for articles that said you should go lower. I was looking for anything out there, and I was not seeing anybody arguing, oh, the discount rate should be higher. And then on the current versus intergenerational, this is, the issue we've talked about, where I think there was a proposal that maybe we could use a 3% discount rate for our net present value calculations, but that we use we'd use a 1% discount rate for our net present value calculations, but then use a 3% discount rate for our societal cost of capital. That would basically, as we discussed in the last meeting, need an argument that the discount rate in the future should be higher than the current one. And I still haven't seen any literature to support that. Again, I can make arguments in my head because I have a big imagination, but I'm not seeing any literature going in that direction. It all goes in the other direction, that the future intergenerational discount rate should be lower than the current generation discount rate. So now let me any questions on that? And then I was going to go back to the spreadsheet. Does that mean everybody understands, or did I just talk too fast?
I think it's just everybody agrees with you.
Okay, I like that. If only it were true. I won't even, 5 minutes from now, I won't even agree with me, Judge. So let's see. Do I have the right? I just want to make sure I have the right one up here. Okay, so if you look in that spreadsheet I sent earlier, we were looking at the decisions tab. I am really, I don't know whether is anyone prepared to kind of walk through and opine on these different topics, and we can fill in your numbers, and then we can, real time, Christine and I will pull the scenarios that align with your proposals. Or if you're not inclined to do that, you can go to this summary tab, and we got, these are 25 of the scenarios that seem, or actually, I don't know what our numbering is there, but 24 or something scenarios that seem to be in play right now.
All right, Joe, I know I can speak for Judge Burke and myself. We didn't see a column, but we're ready to discuss at length. And we're ready to weigh in and give our opinions.
Okay.
I'm obviously kidding.
Okay.
Nicole has her hand up.
Yes, I would just say for the most part, we probably could do that. I didn't, I guess, prepare it in table format, so it's going to take me some time to match our positions to the table, but I feel like we're ready to discuss most of those topics.
If that's the case, if others might be, and I just didn't know whether there would be any appetite for it, Judge, how about if we take a break, let people go think about it, or is it even, it's not even, I don't know if it's lunchtime or not, but, and then we could come back.
No, that's great. How about we come back at 1 o'clock?
That would work for me.
Excellent. All right. We'll see.
Your Honor, this
Yes.
is Dylan. Before we do that, I mean, I'm happy to work with Nicole and go through that. Or any, should we expect any other parties besides OPC to be ready to do that? And it doesn't. I'm not saying it's contingent on
You don't
anything.
want to
I'm
show
just
your
curious.
hands?
No, I think we do actually, but I'm just curious.
I don't know. Anybody else? Sheldon? Anybody from the utilities? You guys going to be ready to show your hand?
I'll have to talk with the other utilities on the break.
Okay. All right. Very good. All right.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor.
It might be a short afternoon, at least on this, but we still have the non-energy benefits to discuss. So we have that.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Okay, sounds good. All right. So we'll plan on coming back at 1 o'clock.
Sounds good.
All right. We'll see everybody then.